My name is Joseph Banister, and I'm a former IRS Criminal Investigation Division Special Agent. I worked at the IRS from 1993 through 1999, and I resigned from the IRS because I researched some issues about the legitimacy, about the way the income tax laws are enforced and administered, and my supervisors at the IRS refused to address any of my concerns and questions and encouraged me to resign. And so I went ahead and resigned in February of 1999. How many people have any of us met who say, I love the income tax? You know, most Americans, if not all of them, don't like it. So why do we have it? Did the American people want it in the first place? No. Do they want it to continue? No. And yet any time there's a movement, a coalescence of people trying to make something different happen, well, the IRS just sits up there like a shooting gallery and just picks off anybody that has a contrary opinion. So that really disgusted me. And as far as apprehension, certainly when you see the kind of dirty tricks, shall we say, or deceit that's going on, it gave me a real apprehensive feeling about, well, you know, who am I working for? What is this agency? What is it really about? And is there any integrity here? Because I consider myself a man of integrity. I mean, at least I try very hard to be honorable. And yet, am I going to be able to maintain any honor or integrity with this agency? But I also wanted to give them the benefit of the doubt, the IRS. The government, because even to this day I don't think of myself as anti-government or anti-tax. I come from a family of government servants. I have not abandoned the idea that we need some level of government. But the level we have, basically it's like the inmates running the asylum kind of thing. Our government is out of control, it's not answerable to the people, and the one agency for sure that is unaccountable to the people is the IRS. When a person works for a living, they go out to work for the day and they work 8 hours and they get paid for 8 hours, well, they're engaging in an activity that is constitutionally protected. You have a constitutionally protected right to the fruits of your own labor. And in fact, the Supreme Court has ruled over and over again that the definition of income, I-N-C-O-M-E, income on a legal and constitutional basis, is a gain or a profit. And when you go out and trade your 8 hours of work for 8 hours of pay, you've not realized any kind of gain or profit. The Supreme Court has defined what income is, and what we do each day to work, to survive, to make a living, we do not earn income in that sense. And so therefore, for the IRS to tell us that we are, the IRS is deceiving us and lying to us and saying that they're going to tax something that is not taxable. The IRS will assert in a great deal of its literature that you have to be liable for a tax in order to be required to pay it. But when you go to the Internal Revenue Code and actually look for the section or sections that make you liable, it's not there. There are sections that make people liable to pay a tax on distilled liquor, on cigarette rolling papers, on airline tickets, on all kinds of things. It's very clearly laid out who's liable to pay the tax. But for the income tax, the only people or groups that are made liable to pay the income tax are withholding agents who are withholding from payments to non-resident aliens or foreign corporations. So here we have the IRS saying that liability is an important issue. Liability is something that each of us needs to determine. And yet when you go to the Internal Revenue Code to find where you might become liable, it's only a very limited set of circumstances that don't apply to most Americans. Most Americans don't deal with non-resident aliens or foreign corporations. Most Americans aren't withholding agents. And that's the only place where liability is even brought up with regard to income tax. So Bill Benson was the author of a book called The Law That Never Was. He actually co-authored the book with a man named Red Beckman. And The Law That Never Was basically revisited the ratification process of the 16th Amendment. And so what Bill did is he went to each and every one of the 48, at the time it was 48 contiguous United States, prior to Hawaii and Alaska. And he traveled by small airplane or driving to each and every one of those 48 contiguous United States. And he went to the state archives for each state and looked at their records and archives as to what they did in the ratification process. And during that process, he came up time and time again with basically a lack of a ratification by the state, an outright rejection. For example, Kentucky, when Bill went to Kentucky and their state archives, he found Senate documents that indicated that the Kentucky Senate actually voted 22-9 to reject the 16th Amendment. And yet, the federal government, included Kentucky as one of the ratifying states. So that happened over and over again. I mean, Kentucky was the most egregious, I would say. But state after state, California, Missouri, Illinois, all these different states had their own story for how they either outright didn't ratify it or how their own procedures basically failed to ratify it according to the constitutional standards. I was told prior to meeting Bill that, this stuff is a bunch of BS and there's no evidence to prove it. And after interacting with Bill, he had nothing but documentation. It was actually had still the ribbons on the archived copies from the states. So this wasn't just some guy with a photocopy machine who decided to create a bunch of BS to try to fool people. He had actual, solid evidence of a lack of ratification, or at a minimum, a fraudulent ratification of the 16th Amendment. The IRS, believe it or not, the IRS uses the term voluntary compliance quite frequently in its literature. And then people, citizens over the years, over the decades, who have looked very closely at what the IRS does, have encountered these pieces of literature, these statements referring to voluntary compliance. And I think it's a common human reaction that you look at an agency that claims that you're required to pay this tax, and yet they use the word voluntary or voluntary compliance over and over and over again in their own literature. In fact, the commissioner of the IRS a number of times, certainly in the 1990s, actually said so in their message, their annual message to the public, that thank you for voluntarily complying with the income tax laws. And I think that actually they use the term voluntary compliance to try to get around some real difficult issues that they have to wrestle with. Like, do we really have the authority to tax someone's labor? Do we really have the authority to make someone file a tax return if they're not liable for the tax in the first place? And so it's almost like a couching or sidestepping to just say, well, thank you for voluntarily complying, because if everybody's volunteering, we don't have to be accused of making anybody do anything. But obviously that's not the case with the IRS. The biggest impediment, or largest impediment, I would say, to a person being able to simply assert the truth or assert what they read in the law is that the arenas that you are taken to assert those arguments are very tightly controlled. So for example, if you try to take an argument like, well, I don't have any income when I go to work and trade my work for money. If you tried to make that argument in a tax court, in a U.S. tax court, a civil proceeding, they would fine you, the government, the IRS, would fine you $25,000 for simply trying to make that argument. And so if you're fighting over $5,000 and you want to argue, but they're going to charge you another $25,000, it kind of puts it into perspective of what freedom you have to truly assert your beliefs and your position, even if it comes from a Supreme Court case. They'll still fine you $25,000 even for bringing it up. In a criminal case where someone's been accused of willfully not filing a tax return or evading tax, again, they may want, the defendant may want to bring up a reason, which actually in almost all criminal tax cases, your reasoning is actually critical to determining whether you've committed a crime or not. Because if you believe that you actually were doing the right thing, and the jury believes you believed it, then they're supposed to acquit you. But what the government, the prosecution will do is ridicule you and make it sound like, oh, well, how could you possibly believe these things? Never mind that your position is based on a Supreme Court case or something like that. So they'll use ridicule. They'll use their own literature and say, well, we, the IRS, have already dispensed with that argument through this pamphlet. But you looked at the Supreme Court case and saw that the Supreme Court case was never overturned. So wouldn't the Supreme Court case trump an IRS pamphlet? Well, in your mind, and possibly in the law's mind, yes, but in the minds of a jury who's not familiar with the issues, they may think, well, the IRS gave them a pamphlet, that should be enough. Another thing is that federal judges in criminal tax trials will often not allow certain arguments or evidence to be even made. They'll just refuse to allow it to be heard by the jury. And lastly, another terrible development is that a judge will tell the jury, regardless of what the defendant told you, I'm telling you that the law requires you to file tax returns. In all cases, the law requires you to pay the income tax. And I'm the judge, and I'm telling you what the law requires. So it's a very tightly controlled arena, and that's sometimes where people are taken. Thankfully, the IRS doesn't have the resources to take everybody there. But it's basically like a little scourging area where they can, whip you bloody, and you really have no recourse and very little help. Not that it's non-existent. I mean, I've been to those arenas and actually been blessed with some reasonably good results, but it is rare just because they hold all the cards and they don't want you to win, and so you really have to be well prepared ahead of time to get through that gauntlet, that minefield, and get to the other side without your legs getting blown off. I think there's a tremendous value in fighting this problem, fighting the deceit of the IRS, but I encourage people to do as much educating of themselves and fact-finding without trumpeting what they're doing. Because especially in this day and age with all of the government surveillance that's going on, the government relies on people trumpeting their beliefs so that then the government can then turn the focus and the surveillance and scrutiny on that person. At some point, people may have to go overt, shall we say, but I encourage people to stay covert in terms of their beliefs and their educating of themselves and their research as long as possible, because it has a twofold benefit. It leaves there's no worry because at least in this day and age, until Big Brother gets a camera into our homes, we still have an opportunity to fill our minds with information relatively anonymously. That's changing rapidly, but relatively anonymously we can fill our minds with information. Secondly, it also prevents the government from getting what they would call a hard target, or at least what a law enforcement person would call a hard target. You can't really focus on who it is that's getting this information or how it's being spread. So the more, as I call it, stealth activism you can do, the more stealth education and learning that you can do, the better off you'll be. Because you know, I don't like to think about the government as our enemy, but in its current posture, where it is disobeying the law and the Constitution, you have to at least treat them like they are the enemy. And you know, be kind, be patient, be calm. Don't overreact if you encounter government people, but you don't need to let them know what you're thinking either. So I don't think it's futile at all to educate yourself about what the IRS does. In some cases, you may have to assert yourself, but wait as long as you can. Educate yourself as much as you can before that day, so that you'll be the most prepared you can be.